Hi, everyone. Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lothar Krinke. He's the CEO of Newronika. Newronika is a company working on building neural devices in order to restore brain and body functions. He's also an adjunct assistant professor at West Virginia University. Dr. Krinke holds a PhD in molecular biology from SUNY Albany. He completed postdoctoral training at California Institute of Technology. He also has previous experience as CEO at Welcony, an executive in DBS and neuromodulation at Medtronic, as VP of business development at various biotech companies, as well as in management consulting at McKinsey and Company and A.T. Kearney. So, can you tell us your story? I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Of course, if you look at my resume, you think, well, how does this all fit together, right? So I like to start by telling you what my passion is. My passion really is to develop technology that matters to patients, but not only to be in the research space, but actually develop it so it can make a difference to people's lives. So very early in my career, I actually decided I needed to be at that interface of science and business. So I jumped back and forth a couple of times in business. So my story really is I came to the U.S. in the mid '80s to be a molecular biologist. Biotech was taking off, right? So and then I ended up also doing my qualifiers in neuroscience. Ended up at the California Institute of Technology, thinking was going to either join a biotech company or do the academic route, and then something surprising happened. The wall in Germany came down, and I had to go back to my home country. I had to be there to see what was going on with the unification, right? And so I ended up joining McKinsey and Company and worked on various projects, including projects that had to do with the German reunification. Eventually came back to the US. At some point decided that what happened with this thing about biotech and startup companies. So I joined Celera, the company that sequenced the genome. And then after that, joined a company that had licensed the cardiac stem cell, which then got me to Medtronic, because Medtronic at the time had the question of, should a medical device company be in biotech, right? Because you have medical devices that you might need to deliver the biologic and so on. Anyway, so I ended up at Medtronic and eventually became extremely interested in infusing large molecules into the brain. So large molecules don't cross the blood-brain barrier. So could we devise technology to get large molecules across the blood-brain barrier for diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? And then eventually I ran the research team in neuromodulation, got really interested in deep brain stimulation, and then ran the DBS business for Medtronic, the deep brain stimulation business, from 2011 to 2017. I left Medtronic because with 55, you can leave Medtronic and retire. And then I ran this company, Welcony, for 5 years. And this company was involved in non-invasive brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, EEG, and technologies like this. Because my vision was, hey, if we want to make neuromodulation available to millions of patients around the world, DBS is too expensive, so let's look at TMS and other things. But the problem with TMS, of course, is very inconvenient. If patients have to go present to the clinic, which is, very difficult logistically speaking. So I came back to DBS and joined Newronika CEO, and we've developed, and that was actually before I came on board, really the most advanced deep brain stimulation system so far. And our story is in a way simple. We're closing the loop in deep brain stimulation by using brain signals to control the deep brain stimulation system. Okay, so that's the background.
Wow, it's been such an interesting journey, and it's pretty cool. You've got experience across a broad range of different types of tools and projects and industries. And even within neurotechnology, it's pretty awesome that you've been able to work both in the invasive and the non-invasive side of things. And yeah, just a very, very deep background. I was wondering what sparked your initial interest and involvement in neuroscience and neurotechnology. I think you mentioned that you studied neuroscience a little bit during your school years, during your undergraduate or perhaps graduate school years, and then you went away from it for a little bit and then ended up coming back to it. And so what sparked that initial interest when you first started studying it?
Well, so, I was at Caltech, and, even then, everyone said, even in the 90s, well, we sort of had the decade of the genes, and really what's going to happen over the next 20 years was we had to really understand how the brain worked, right? So it was pretty clear leading thinkers in sort of in the science field said, biological science right now I'm biotech, molecular biology, but neuroscience is where we need to go. So I always had an interest in that space to try to figure out how we can help the human conditions. On top of that, let's face it, neurodegenerative diseases are growing at an alarming rate because of the aging population and other factors, really. And neurodegenerative diseases in the US alone cause about $800 billion of socioeconomic costs. So we have to solve that healthcare problem. And so I've always been interested in that space, and technology can make a huge difference in the brain, or actually in the entire central nervous system, because the advantage of neurotechnology is that we can be very targeted and we can close the loop, and we don't have to depend on more systemic kind of approaches. So it can be very precise both in where we intervene in the brain or other areas in the nervous system, and how precisely we can intervene. And of course, now a lot of people talk about, electronic medicine or bioelectronics, things like that. But, at the end of the day, this is all neurotech.
It's such a fascinating field, and I totally agree. We're starting to get the technology where we can be a lot more precise and really help out a ton of people. And so now we know a little bit about your background. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background and even the origins of Newronika?
Yeah, so Newronika was formed really as a spin-out company out of two great institutions in Milano, the University of Milano and the Policlinico, which is a clinical site. There was this professor, or still is, Alberto Priori, who had worked on neurophysiology in patients with Parkinson's disease that were undergoing deep brain stimulation. And he worked very early on this biomarker, the beta oscillation. And essentially him and a couple of his PhD students formed the company, Newronika, around the concept of closed loop DBS. So it's a typical story of an observation made in the clinic and then diligent work with collaborating data scientists, engineers, and clinicians to form Newronika. And then Newronika over time raised sufficient cash to initially build an external device for recording brain signals and stimulating the brain, then built a fully implanted system, which is, by the way, this is where the magic is. This is what a deep brain stimulator looks like. It's also implanted usually here. And then got a CE mark a couple of years ago. And since we had the CE mark, we were able to do clinical trials in Europe. And the clinical trials in Europe with adaptive DBS, which is closed loop DBS, have been very successful. So now we're in a position where we have submitted for MDR compliant CE mark for adaptive DBS. Hopefully we'll get that this year so we can launch next year. For the United States, we do have to complete a pivotal study, which is about to start, so we can get FDA pre-market approval in 2026 or so.
Well, wishing you and your team best of luck on that pivotal study, and also congratulations on all the milestones already passed. I was wondering if you could share like a little bit more on the actual closed loop methodology. I think you mentioned something about beta oscillations that were being developed at that lab, or were being analyzed at that lab.
Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with the space, just think about a cardiac pacemaker and think of an AM radio. And if you put the two things together, you essentially have closed loop DBS. Yeah, I'm joking a little bit, but it's a good way of thinking about it. So a cardiac pacemaker that most of us are familiar with, in fact, my mom just got one just before Christmas. Cardiac pacemakers are implanted just like this system in the patient's chest, and then wires go to the heart. In deep brain stimulation, instead of going to the heart, these wires go subcutaneously into the brain, specifically into the midbrain in this area called the basal ganglia that are, at least for Parkinson's, they're responsible for coordinating all kinds of activities, including movements. Okay, so if you stimulate in a particular area of the midbrain, and it's called the subthalamic nucleus, you can treat Parkinson's disease. So now we understand what DBS is. It's a pacemaker for the brain that treats Parkinson's. Now the AM radio. So what Alberto Priori, who I mentioned earlier, worked on for many years is that if you look at the power spectrum of local field potential. So what is local field potential? Many people are familiar with EEG, electroencephalography, right? It's the same thing, but it's in the brain. So you record through these wires that the patient has in the brain for stimulation. You can record signals. And those are, basically these wavy lines, like an AM radio transmission. And how an AM radio works, it actually, that's why it measures the changes in amplitudes in a certain frequency. So you dial the AM radio to the frequency, and then the power modulation gives you the signal on the radio. And that's how this device works. We're looking at the entire spectrum, but then we specifically zoom into a frequency of about 13 hertz called the beta range. And there's a lot of activity, a lot of noise, if you will. If it was an AM radio, there's a lot of noise, a lot of activity in that 13 hertz range. And the amount of this power is correlated with the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So if a patient takes medication, this biomarker goes down. If the medication wears off, the biomarker goes up. So we can use that as a control input to control our deep brain stimulation system. So based on this biomarker, our system then automatically adjusts the stimulation amplitude. So the patient gets the precise amount of electricity minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, no more, no less. So just think of a cardiac pacemaker and AM radio, put them together, you have adaptive DBS.
A pacemaker for the brain, as they say. And that seems super useful for the patients. As you said, having just the right amount of stimulation, no more, no less, it sounds like it could really help them cut down on things like side effects and also just have the best experience possible with their treatment. And so we've talked a lot about the benefits of the DBS system. Are there any additional risks associated with making it closed loop?
Yeah, so first of all, then there are not a lot of additional risks because today we have a closed loop system, but the loop is really closed by the physician who changes the stimulation parameters on these IPG. And sometimes the physician will let the patient to make some changes on their own with a device that sends commands via telemetry to the system, okay? And so the neurologist always defines an upper and a lower limit for stimulation amplitude. And so we're just automating what otherwise the neurologist or the patient could do themselves by hand. So therefore, we argue there's not a lot of incremental risk because we set the upper limit and the lower limit of stimulation. Now, but to be honest, the biggest concern with a system like this is, of course, it's getting more complex, right? We all know the more complex systems get, the more failure modes there are, right? And so there are failure modes, of course, that could happen, which is why we do an incredible amount of testing on these devices. And so far, they have performed incredibly well in the patients that have already received this device. And so we have had no serious adverse events so far. And we're tracking, of course, the performance of the system to make sure that it doesn't fail because of the complexity. These systems, if they have really a failure mode where it can't handle complexity, they essentially shut off and reset, just like a computer, right? And so the failure mode is that the system basically reboots.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you mentioned, like having that upper and lower bound, it kind of ties right back to the risks of the current systems. It seems like it doesn't add so much additional because no matter if you're using the adaptive or the non-adaptive, it's still having that upper and lower bound. So when it turns off and then turns back on, does it generally kind of fall back right into the same algorithms as before? Like
That's what would happen. And by the way, it's not ours. All DBS systems have sort of reset modes, right? Ours just has the closed loop. And I just want to say one thing. For the FDA, we of course have to prove it that it's safe and efficacious, which is why we're doing a pivotal trial. So I can't make safety claims until we've really shown them in a clinical study. But so far, so good in our first clinical experiences.
Now making a pivot to something that I found on the Newronika website, the WebBioBank. Has this database been around the whole time that the system has been around? And could you tell us a little bit more about how it works?
Yeah, I mean, it's some level relatively simple, right? It's an Azure database where we can upload data. And right now we're only using it internally, right? Because we don't actually sell our system. So we're using it only internally, but it is fully developed. We now have some 40,000 hours of continuous brain recordings already from our patients. And that grows and grows because we have patients walking around with these systems. And once a day, all the brain sensing data is uploaded to our system. So this WebBioBank essentially has all this brain sensing data, but it can also accommodate additional data such as patient self-reported outcomes. We will be using wearables, so we can upload this. So it essentially becomes a database that can be used for several reasons. Number one, for benchmarking. So benchmarking is important, especially as quality healthcare continues to develop. People want to show my center has good outcomes. Number two, it really, most importantly, the neurologist has the ability to see what's happening in the patient remotely, so remote monitoring. And then it's a discovery platform because we're sitting on all this data and we can discover new biomarkers and things along those lines.
That sounds super useful in a lot of different aspects. I think you mentioned the other data streams that were coming in, like, for example, the wearables and the patient self-reported outcomes and such. Are you able to correlate that directly to their brain activity and use that to continue informing the adaptation algorithm, for example?
So I have to be honest, we're still a small company, right? So there's only so much you can do at one time. But for example, we're in the process of really hiring a top-notch data scientist / AI expert to really help us with analyzing this data. But I'll give you a simple example. What we observe in many of these patients is that during sleep, the brain signals, of course, change. So we can detect sleep with our system, which is fairly useful because when the patient wakes up in the morning, right, then they need medication, and DBS needs to crank up. So we can have really nice correlations between what actually, because we have a marker. We know when the patient woke up. We know that typically at that point they will take medication. The DBS goes up, so we can study these correlations. That would be one. The other one that we are very excited about, in fact, we applied for a grant. As a small company, you have to use grants as well. We think we can detect freezing of gait. So in Parkinson's, one of the symptoms in Parkinson's is freezing of gait, where the patient then all of a sudden cannot, move their legs. And we think we can detect that directly from the brain. You might say, well, you can detect that with an accelerometer that you put on a leg, right? The problem with that, of course, is inconvenient. The patient would have to actually wear an accelerometer. You have to think about how that accelerometer actually communicates with this device. How do you do that so no one hacks into it? So a better way actually to do this is if the brain can actually detect it. And more importantly, we don't want to actually detect the freezing of gait. We want to actually predict the freezing of gait episode. So we want to find the biomarker, and we think we have the first data that suggests we have it. We'll find it. There's a biomarker that says there will be a freezing of gait episode, so let's change stimulation parameters. So these are the kinds of things that we think we're going to discover from this database. And by the way, sorry, I'm excited about this. Obviously, you can tell I'm a scientist, but I'm also a businessman. But let's talk science now. This beta oscillation, this beta biomarker, you don't need machine learning to this. It stares you in the face. I mean, you can look at the raw signal and you see it, okay? So there will be other signals. And with this database, we can discover these other signals and correlate them, right? I mean, look at the EEG field, right? Now, yes, in epilepsy, an epileptologist typically still looks actually and at the EEG traces. But then there's companies that are investing in EEG to stratify patients, for example, for depression. Alto Biosciences, for example, one of these companies. And so they use very sophisticated algorithms to detect these biomarkers, and they often are multi-feature. What I mean by multi-features, it's not just one beta oscillation, but it is a combination of features, both in the power or time domain.
Yeah, it sounds like this data set or this database will just become more and more useful over time. And it sounds like you guys are working on some really helpful and useful and interesting things with it already. I'm especially excited about that gait prediction study that you mentioned, and wishing you and your team best of luck with that grant, first off, and also just excited to see what comes out of that. What's next for Newronika? You talked a little bit about the pivotal trial in the US and a little bit about that Gait prediction study. Is there anything else coming up on the horizon for you guys?
Yeah, so the most important part is we still have to, continuously improve our product. Okay, so we're going to change from just being a hardware company really to a hardware and data and software company. And the nice thing about software is you can have new iterations very quickly, because this is, at the end of the day, this is a computer. So you can download all kinds of different algorithms. You can reconfigure how the system actually works. Okay, so we continue working on this, improving it. Specifically, though, we need to do this pivotal trial, which is a rather large trial that starts in Europe and then continues in the United States, so we can get FDA approval. We will launch, hopefully, in Europe next year with our adaptive DBS in a kind of very controlled way, most likely with research centers that really would like to take advantage of the incredible technology in here. So this is pretty straightforward, and as a small company, we need to be laser focused. Where we go next with new indications, that our plan there is we go where the science takes us. So we want to collaborate with scientists and clinicians around the world and have them tell us where we need to go next, which is why we work with various centers around the world on grant applications, really their grant applications. So they apply for a grant and we make this device available. And of course, we're part of it because we change certain components of the device, mostly the software.
Yeah, that makes sense. Never a bad idea to follow the science.
Yeah.
I had another quick question about the regulatory bodies. So let's say you're running a clinical trial in Europe. Are you able to use the data from those patients to submit to a regulatory agency in the US, for example, or does it have to be a person in Europe has to be for the Europe clinical trial and a person in the US has to be for the US clinical trial, for example?
So of course, mostly that should be a question to the regulatory bodies in Europe and in the US, the FDA. But our plan is to combine. So we will do an international study, same protocol, all the same, and we'll have centers initially in Italy, in Germany, and then the United States. So what we'll be submitting to the FDA is likely going to be from patients in Europe and the United States. And we're planning to have another meeting with the FDA. It's called a QSUB meeting to precisely discuss this approach.
Well, sounds like there's a good path ahead.
Yeah.
My next question is, what advice do you have for students or perhaps young professionals or even people that are in the middle of their career that are aiming or hoping to work in the field of neurotech or do something more related to neuroscience than what they're currently working on?
Yeah. So the biggest need in our space right now is we need data scientists, machine learning or AI experts, if you want to call it that are interested in our space. So the advice I would give to someone who wants to be in the space, focus on engineering, biomedical engineering, really learn how to do machine learning. This is so important these days. Get clinical experience with physicians and clinicians. So be really focused on learning sort of the medical aspects. I think those three things need to come together: the engineering, the data science, and the clinical experience. But don't forget the neuroscience. Okay. So at the end of the day, neuroscience is incredibly important here to put all the data, all the medical, all the engineering into sort of the broader context. So it is important to sort of look across the disciplines. But yeah, neuroscience, biomedical engineering, data science, and really a keen interest in how patient care actually happens.
Yeah, it really is a super interdisciplinary field, and totally agree with you there. It's important to really have some exposure to all those sides of the field in order to do the best work and to understand more clearly what the mission is and what the goals are. For engineers, what would be a good way for them to get clinical experience? Perhaps just like ask doctors to shadow them, or do some time in a research lab, or like a clinical research lab, for example.
Yeah, so my advice would be to work with a center that is deeply interested in clinical research, but applies technology to clinical research. And in my experience, the magic really happens when the engineer slash neuroscientist and the physician get together and respect each other as peers, right? So it's not like one is more important than the other. They really need to work really in a very collaborative way. And so I think it's less about how exactly do you do this, but find a center or a place where there's a tight integration between clinical care and engineering. So there's centers around the world that have really embraced this, and there's centers where maybe that is not there yet. I don't want to name examples, but find a place where the engineering school and the medical school work very closely together. I give you one example because I live in Minnesota. The University of Minnesota is really trying this and is doing this fairly well by integrating the engineering with the medical science.
And I've definitely heard good things about the University of Minnesota from those aspects, like integrating those things together. And it really is super important for those two groups of people, those two teams, to be working closely together. Do you have any predictions for the field of neurotechnology over the long term? Let's say perhaps the next 20 years, and that could be specifically in the space that you're working in right now, so specifically in the DBS space, or it can be even zoomed out and just over the field of neurotechnology at large.
Yeah, look, obviously predictions are always hard. I mean, the one thing I can tell you that the evolution of technology in the medical field always goes a lot slower than you expected because of, we're dealing with humans, right? And we need to really make sure that, we dot the I's and cross the T's to make sure that the patients are safe. So technology develops slowly. So I'm glad you said 20 years and not 5 or 10 years, because things really move slowly. But I think in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see incredible changes in this space, because there's really a lot of investment, both private, but also government grant funding going into that space. Think of the BRAIN initiative in the US and the BRAIN initiatives in various other countries or regions around the world. So more and more interesting devices are being developed that could be used for research, but eventually will find themselves in medical use. So my prediction, so we will see real amazing progress in this BCI field, brain-computer interface, which initially could be unidirectional, and people are making incredible progress there, right? So speech decoding is a very hot area, right? Speech decoding and neuroprosthesis, I think we will see massive advances here in the next 10 years. Certainly in research and prototyping in the next 20 years, it will make an impact on the human condition. So that would be number one. I think our understanding of the brain will increase exponentially because of all this new data that we're bringing in. And I'm thinking a lot about a different field. So I came from molecular biology, DNA sequencing, right? The original sequencing of the human genome was billions of dollars, right? Now you can sequence a genome for a few $100s, right? So, and that's technology, right? This is essentially technology. And I think the same thing is happening in neuroscience, that the data density that we can create is increasing on an exponential rate. So we will have an amazing insight into how the brain works, how diseases will develop, and that will help not just neurotech. I mean, yes, neurotech, depending how broad you define it. I mean, this will happen this will help biopharmaceutical companies, diagnostics companies, medical device companies. So I think there will be a great advantage there. And then getting back to DBS, what we will find is adaptive DBS. Now, of course, I'm biased, but I think it will become standard of care in the next 5 to 10 years for sure, because it just makes so much sense. Just think about, diabetes pumps and other closed loop systems. And at the same time, I think we're going to have new indications. I can't predict which one is going to come through, but there's a lot of activity in new indications for deep brain stimulation. And most importantly, I think our devices will become less invasive over time because they're still kind of large. I mean, this thing is still pretty large if you compare it to how small we can make other electronic devices these days. So the field will become a lot less invasive. And I think it will take more than 20 years. But I talked to my mom, right? She got a cardiac pacemaker. And she said, well, it's not a big deal. I just got a pacemaker, right? Well, I would like to have a world where people say, oh, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. I just got a DBS system, right? But today that we're not there quite yet, right? So patients are always still saying, what do you mean? You're putting wires in my brain, right? Yeah, no one has a problem with putting wires into the heart. So we need to get to a world where that's not a big deal either. I'm sure we get there.
Yeah, I'm sure we will too. And I hope we get to a world like that, maybe sometime within our lifetimes. And yeah, it sounds like there's really exciting and interesting times ahead for the space. And there's going to be, this field is going to help out tons of people. It's already helping out lots of people, but even more than today. That was really the last question that I had for you today. But I was wondering, should the listeners contact you for any types of discussion after the episode? And if so, who should reach out to you? How should they reach out to you? And then what topics about?
So number one, obviously, no cash, no progress. So first and foremost, anyone who's willing to invest in the company or grant us money, please talk to us. We are raising our next round. We're targeting a $30 million or 30 million euro round so we can get all the way to FDA approval. Okay, so anyone who wants to invest in us, please contact us. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, I said we want to go where the science takes us. If there are researchers out there that want to collaborate with us, we'd like to work with them. Now, this would require joint grant applications. We are not a big company that can donate a lot of money, but that's clearly who we really like to talk to. And then, of course, anyone who wants to buy the company eventually, please, contact us and learn about us. But I have one very specific need that will actually become important over the next year. And that is we want to launch in Europe. And we will need distribution channel partners. So anyone who's interested in working with us in distributing this product line, please contact us. So anyone with money, anyone who wants to collaborate scientifically, anyone who wants to buy us, or anyone who wants to distribute our product, please contact us.
Sounds good. I'll make sure to link to your company's website in the show notes, so it's really easy for them to find contact information and all that.